It began with a whisper in the Sistine Chapel name sliding across marble like a serpent in silk, Rodrigo Borgia. The air was thick with incense and ambition, but beneath the holy chants lay a festering rot, for the man soon to wear the triple crown was not chosen by divine will, but by the weight of bribes and the promise of sin. When he rose to the throne of St. Peter as Pope Alexander VI, Rome didn't ascend, it sank into shadow. This was no shepherd of souls, but a master of manipulation whose reign would bathe the eternal city in blood, scandal, and lust. And yet, the true horror was not just in what he did, but in how many praised him while he did it. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in the Spanish town of Zativa in the Kingdom of Valencia, under the crown of Aragon. His uncle, Alonso de Borgia, was a cardinal who later became Pope Calixtus III, advantageous bloodline that would soon define Rodrigo's meteoric rise. Rodrigo studied law at the University of Bologna and quickly gained a reputation as intelligent, cunning, and irresistibly charming. He was tall, handsome, with a commanding presence that disarmed even the most skeptical adversary. By the age of 25, he was appointed cardinal deacon and vice-chancellor of the Church, one of the most powerful positions in the Vatican. But behind this ecclesiastical facade lay an unabashed hunger for dominance. Rodrigo was not just ambitious, he was unapologetically corrupt. He openly kept mistresses, fathered multiple children, and flaunted his wealth in ways that shocked even a morally flexible Renaissance Italy. His primary mistress, Vanosa de Catane, bore him 4 children, Giovanni, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffriche, of whom would become tools in his elaborate dynastic ambitions. His private life was no secret. In fact, it was almost performative, as if daring his critics to challenge him. When Pope Innocent VIII died in 1492, the papal conclave convened to elect a new pontiff. It was not a holy election, it was an auction. Rodrigo Borgia bribed fellow cardinals with money, estates, and lucrative appointments. His most notorious opponent, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, the future Pope Julius II, accused him of simonia grave signet, could not match his rival's wealth or cunning. On the 11th of August, 1492, Rodrigo was crowned Pope Alexander VI. Rome changed almost overnight. The Vatican became the personal court of the Borgia family, and Alexander's papacy became a theater of excess. Lavish banquets, scandalous orgies, and open nepotism marked the early years of his reign. The College of Cardinals was packed with his allies, many of whom owed him their positions. Meanwhile, his children, particularly the brilliant and brutal Cesare and the enigmatic Lucrezia, were maneuvered into positions of power across Italy, weaving a web of influence that stretched far beyond the walls of Rome. Under Alexander's rule, the Church was no longer a bastion of moral authority, but a family enterprise cartel cloaked in cassocks. The Pope used his spiritual authority to grant indulgences not for piety, but for profit. He sold bishoprics like trinkets, and excommunication became a political weapon rather than a spiritual punishment. Rome groaned under the weight of his extravagance, yet his grip remained firm. But the true scope of his evil was not in the excess alone. It was in the methodical, calculated nature of his control. He did not merely indulge in sin, he institutionalized it. He turned the very idea of righteousness into a joke whispered in Roman taverns. The Borgia emblema bull soon came to symbolize not strength, but predation. And yet, for all this, Alexander maintained the outward trappings of holiness, conducting mass, issuing papal bulls, and declaring crusades with blood still fresh on his hands. Outside Rome, Italy was fracturing. The great city-states Milan, Venice, Florence, and Naples were locked in a deadly dance of alliances and betrayals. France eyed the peninsula hungrily, and Alexander, ever the tactician, played each side against the other, shifting loyalties when convenient, forging treaties only to break them when it served his family's ascent. Inside the Vatican, however, his world began to darken. The very children he had raised to be weapons especially, Cesare grew more dangerous than even he had anticipated. Whispers turned to rumors, rumors to fear, of poisonings, disappearances, and backroom murders, ordered in candlelit silence. Some claimed Alexander hosted orgies in the Apostolic Palace. Others said he blessed Cesare's killings as divine justice. Truth and myth bled together in a city that had lost its sense of sanctity. And yet, Alexander remained unrepentant. He believed he was divinely protected, chosen by God to reshape the church heaven if that meant dragging it through the mire first. He adorned himself in gold, presided over blasphemous feasts, and watched his enemies fall one by one. But pride, like wine, ferments quickly into poison. Rome was watching. Italy was shifting. And even Alexander's iron grip could not hold forever. If Alexander VI was the architect of corruption, his son Cesare Borgia was its executioner. Handsome, brilliant, and utterly merciless, Cesare was everything a Renaissance prince should be, except for one thing. He was the illegitimate son of the Vicar of Christ. And under his father's guidance, Cesare would wield power not just from the shadows, but with a sword drawn and dripping. Together they did not merely rule the church, they carved it into a dynastic empire. Cesare's rise was as unconventional as it was bloody. Born around 1475, he was the second son of Rodrigo Borgia and Venosa de Catane. Originally destined for the church, Cesare was made a cardinal at just 18, but the red robes of ecclesiastical office never fit him. He was a soldier at heart and a tactician by nature. Cold-eyed and fearless, Cesare longed for command, not communion. That moment came in 1497, with a death that shocked Rome. Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia, Cesare's elder brother and Rodrigo's favorite, was found floating in the Tiber, throat slit, body weighed down with stones. No one was ever charged, but rumors spiraled like vultures that Cesare, consumed by envy, had orchestrated the murder. Even Alexander wept publicly and launched a hollow investigation. But within a year, Cesare shed his cardinal robes and emerged reborn not as a man of God, but as the Pope's personal warlord. The father now anointed the son not with oil, but with blood. In 1499, Cesare was granted the title Duke of Valentinois and sent to subdue the Romagnan unruly region of northern Italy. Armed with French troops, bribed mercenaries, and papal authority, Cesare marched like a conqueror. City after city fell before him: Imola, Forlì, Rimini, Finzacch, submission enforced by terror. His cruelty was methodical. Enemies were lured into trust, then executed. Families vanished overnight. His symbol, a crimson bull, became synonymous with death. Alexander cheered every victory. From his seat in the Vatican, he redrew Italy like a chessboard, placing Cesare at its center. The church was now financing war campaigns, selling indulgences to fund massacres, while the Pope preached salvation by day and plotted assassinations by night. It was a regime of divine hypocrisy. At the same time, Alexander's daughter Lucrezia became a pawn in the grand strategy. Often painted as a femme fatale, Lucrezia was more victim than villain. Her marriages arranged, annulled, or abandoned to suit her father's shifting political needs. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza of Milan, was discarded when his alliance lost value. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, was brutally murdered, strangled in his bed, allegedly on Cesare's orders. Some whispered of incest between Lucrezia and her father or brother, though much of this was likely propaganda from their many enemies. Still, the rumors endured, fed by the surreal obscenity of papal politics. Meanwhile, the streets of Rome turned into stages of grotesque spectacle. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, held in 1501, reportedly within the Apostolic Palace, was a debauched affair involving dozens of courtesans, clerics, and nobles. Naked dancers, wine-stained vestments, coins tossed to prostitutes by candlelight. It wasn't just sin, it was celebration. Whether exaggerated or not, it cemented Alexander VI's legacy as the most scandalous pontiff in history. But beneath the feasts and victories, shadows deepened. The Pope's political maneuverings had made him countless enemies. The Italian city-states, weary of his expansionism, began to resist. France, once an ally, grew wary of Cesare's power. Even the College of Cardinals, packed with Alexander's supporters, whispered of betrayal. Then came the turning point, the execution of Cesare's key lieutenant, Ramiro de Lorca. Known for his brutal enforcement in Romagna, Ramiro had ruled with an iron fist on behalf of Cesare. But in 1502, Cesare had him publicly beheaded and displayed in the town square. The message was clear. Loyalty was conditional, and power was expendable. Niccolò Machiavelli, then a Florentine emissary, witnessed Cesare's cunning firsthand and later immortalized him in The Prince as the model of effective but amoral leadership. Machiavelli admired Cesare's brilliance, but even he saw the danger in building power on blood. And as Cesare reached the height of his dominance, the very foundations of the Borgia Empire began to tremble. In the summer of 1503, as Rome sweltered under the oppressive heat, Alexander VI prepared for yet another banquet, this one with a group of cardinals and dignitaries. But shortly after the meal, both he and Cesare fell violently ill. Poison, many believed, perhaps from an enemy seeking revenge, perhaps from food meant for someone else, or perhaps, as the darkest rumors claimed, it was their own trap gone wrong. Alexander survived only a few days. On the 18th of August, 1503, he died in agony, his body grotesquely bloated, his skin blackened, his tongue swollen, eyes bulging in horror. The stench was so foul that the Vatican guards refused to watch over his corpse. Rome rejoiced. Church bells did not toll in mourning, they tolled in relief. The Pope, who had sold heaven for power, who turned the church into a family business of death, was gone. But Cesare still breathed, and what he would do next would decide whether the Borgia nightmare would rise again or be buried for good. When Pope Alexander VI died, the room was not filled with mourning but calculation. Cardinals looked at one another not with grief, but with ambition. The old man's death left a vacuum that had to be filled, and quickly. But for Cesare Borgia, still recovering from the same mysterious illness that had killed his father, the world suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Without Alexander, Cesare was a sword without a sheath, dangerous, exposed, and now utterly alone. Cesare's empire had been built not on legitimacy, but on borrowed power. It was his father who had granted him military titles, provinces, and wealth. Now, all of it trembled on the brink of collapse. And the vultures were circling. The College of Cardinals, filled with men who had once taken bribes from Rodrigo Borgia, now rushed to sever themselves from the family that had disgraced the papacy. They elected a compromise candidate, Pope Pius III. Old, frail, and unlikely to survive long, he was seen as a placeholder, a breathing pause between chaos and clarity. Cesare, still weak but not yet broken, attempted to maneuver behind the scenes. He even forced Pius to confirm his titles and territories. But within 26 days, Pius III was dead, possibly from natural causes, though some whispered the Borgia poison had returned to the table. In his place rose Giuliano della Rovere, Alexander's bitterest enemy, who now took the papal throne as Julius II. A war-hardened cardinal with a mind for vengeance and reform, Julius viewed Cesare not as a nobleman, but as a plague that must be purged. Suddenly, all of Cesare's former allies turned their backs. The lands of Romagna revolted. Fortresses declared independence. Mercenaries fled or changed sides. Cesare himself was arrested in Naples and sent to Spain in chains. The master manipulator had become a prisoner. His fall was not dramatic, it was surgical. Lucrezia Borgia, meanwhile, found her fate diverging sharply. With her father's death and Cesare's fall, she was quietly married off to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. There, she began a new life removed from scandal, cloaked in dignity. Unlike the men of her family, Lucrezia found redemption in distance. In Ferrara, she became a patron of the arts, a mother, and a respected duchess. But her past followed her like a shadow. Rome never forgot. History never forgave. As for Cesare, exile did not extinguish his fire. In 1506, he escaped from his Spanish prison and fled to Navarre, where he offered his sword to King John III. There, among foreign hills and forgotten politics, he fought as a mercenary commander, a pale echo of the prince he once was. But the days of grandeur were over. On the 12th of March, 1507, during a minor siege in the town of Viana, Cesare was ambushed and killed alone, betrayed and stripped of armor. His naked body was left abandoned on the battlefield. Thus ended the life of Cesare Borgia, the man Machiavelli once praised as the ideal prince, not with a coronation, but with a quiet, undignified death in a foreign land. He died as he lived by the sword. The Borgia legacy, however, would not die so easily. Though Julius II worked hard to erase their influence, the scars they left on the church ran deep. The Vatican had been permanently stained by their regnate's moral authority undermined, its holiness questioned. Alexander VI's papacy became the benchmark of ecclesiastical corruption. The selling of indulgences, the hoarding of wealth, the open use of spiritual authority for political gain, these were not just vices, they were the kindling for a coming fire. And that fire would come. Less than a decade later, a German monk named Martin Luther would nail 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation. One of his chief grievances? The systemic corruption of the Catholic Church, a corruption that had reached its peak under Alexander VI. The seeds of Reformation had been sown in the decadence of Rome. Rodrigo Borgia had not just poisoned enemies, had poisoned trust in the Church itself. But even centuries later, the Borgia name persists. Half myth, half monster. Historians debate the truth behind the tales. Were they as evil as legend suggests, or simply the products of an era soaked in treachery? Were Lucrezia's husbands murdered by her brother, or did politics demand their deaths? Did Alexander VI truly host orgies in the Vatican, or did enemies craft a grotesque narrative to suit their agenda? The records are murky, but one fact remains unshakable. No pope before or since ever embodied the total inversion of the Church's values like Alexander VI. He was the shepherd who fed on his flock, the father who crowned his children kings, and the priest who bartered salvation for silver. And in the end, it was not his enemies who destroyed him, it was his success. His ability to twist the Church to his will, to confuse God's authority with his own, had consequences that would ripple far beyond his lifetime. The Renaissance gave him the tools. Ambition gave him the drive. But history gave him his name, the most evil pope in history. In the waning years of the 15th century, while the rest of Christendom looked to Rome for moral direction, the Eternal City had become a playground for vice, greed, and spectacle, none of it hidden. Under Pope Alexander VI, the Vatican transformed into a palace of sin, where the sacred and profane danced openly. The city groaned beneath the weight of its contradictions, its churches towering over streets slick with corruption. The ceremonies remained grand. Pilgrims still flocked to St. Peter's. Priests still intoned Latin blessings. Incense still swirled in shafts of golden light, but it was all theater. Beneath the gilded vestments, cardinals hoarded mistresses and sold favors like merchants. And at the center of this theater sat Alexander, eyes always watching, calculating, feeding his dynasty. No pope had ever wielded power so brazenly for personal ends. The Borgia regime turned ecclesiastical offices into currency. Bishops were auctioned like horses. Pardons for sins were sold in markets. Entire provinces were granted to allies in exchange for loyalty or silence. And those who resisted? They vanished, sometimes into prison cells, sometimes into the Tiber. One of the most chilling tools in Alexander's arsenal was poison. Whether administered through wine, powdered into food, or slipped into candle smoke, the Borgia poison was infamous. Its victims ranged from rival cardinals to political opponents, and always with the same aftermath: silence, fear, and a sudden redistribution of wealth or office to Borgia allies. Cesare was said to carry a hollow ring with a concealed needle, perfect for quick, untraceable death. But there was more than fear in the air, there was also decadence. The wealth poured into Rome during Alexander's reign was unmatched. Artists, architects, and scholars were summoned, and while much of their work laid the foundation for the Roman Renaissance, it was often paid for with blood money. One event, more infamous than any other, became the grotesque symbol of this era: the Banquet of Chestnuts. Held in 1501 within the Apostolic Palace and attended by high-ranking churchmen, the banquet was said to feature 100 courtesans who danced nude before cardinals and nobles. Chestnuts, scattered across the floor, were picked up by the women in suggestive ways as the men watched. Prizes were awarded for performance. Some accounts even claimed that Alexander and Cesare judged the participants personally. Whether exaggerated or not, the story spread like wildfire in Rome. Once the heart of Christian virtue became a symbol of ecclesiastical rot. It wasn't just the Borgia family indulging in this moral collapse. The entire Vatican hierarchy, handpicked by Alexander, operated in a culture of impunity. Factions formed, rivalries sharpened, and the church treasury was emptied to fund the Borgia wars and indulgences. Corruption was not hidden, it was policy. But even amid the sin, there were voices of protest. Friars like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence thundered against papal excess, calling Alexander a heretic and the Antichrist. His words echoed across Italy, stirring unrest. Yet Alexander retaliated, swiftly declaring Savonarola a schismatic and heretic. In 1498, Savonarola was hanged and burned in Florence's central square. The message was clear: defy the Pope, and you will burn. Still, the moral decay could not be concealed. Foreign rulers especially, those in France and Germany, began questioning the legitimacy of Rome. Kings once obedient to papal decrees now treated Alexander as a political actor rather than a divine shepherd. And within the church itself, dissent brewed. At the heart of the scandal was not simply sin, but a total inversion of values. The Pope, meant to be a moral beacon, had become the most corrupt man in Christendom. The Vatican, meant to represent the kingdom of heaven, had become a second Babylon. The name Borgia was no longer merely Spanish, it was synonymous with depravity. As the year 1503 approached, Rome was a city on edge. Whispers of rebellion stirred among the nobility. Foreign armies prowled the Italian borders, and even Alexander's closest allies began to plot their futures in a world without him. The Pope, old but undiminished in ambition, continued to plan more wars, more marriages, more appointments. But nature had plans of its own. That summer, Rome was struck by a wave of suffocating heat. The Tiber stank of rot. The city buzzed with insects, disease, and unrest. And then came the ill-fated banquet hosted by Alexander and Cesare, with select cardinals in attendance. What was meant to be another evening of scheming and celebration turned suddenly into chaos. Both father and son fell violently ill, vomiting, sweating. Trembling, their symptoms were unmistakable. Some believed it was malaria. Others whispered of poison. Perhaps it was their own vial, misapplied. Perhaps one of the cardinals had finally dared to strike back. But whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Alexander VI, the most powerful man in Christendom, began to rot from within. For days he lingered. His skin turned purple. His belly swelled grotesquely. His lips blackened. His body stank so foul that even his closest aides refused to approach. Cesare, still alive but weakened, could do nothing but watch. The man who had made him, who had made everything, was dying, and Rome waited. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. There were no mourners in the streets, no weeping faithful, no thunderous funeral, only a bloated corpse, hurriedly buried to escape the unbearable stench. His tomb was modest, tucked in the church of Santa Maria in Monserrato, far from the grandeur he once commanded. His death left more than a power vacuum, it left a church in disgrace, and a legacy too shameful to bury. With Alexander VI rotting in his hurried grave, the eternal city exhaled tentatively, cautiously. But Rome was not cleansed, it was merely wounded. The stain of the Borgia papacy had not vanished with his death. It lingered in every corner of the Vatican, in the mistrust of foreign rulers, in the minds of the common faithful, and above all, in the figure of his surviving son, Cesare Borgia. Cesare emerged from the sickness that had nearly killed him physically intact, but politically crippled. His father was gone, and with him, the ecclesiastical machine that had fueled the Borgia rise. Though still technically Duke of Romagna and commander of several papal fortresses, Cesare now stood on a battlefield with no army, no allies, and no patron. And worst of all, his enemies were gathering. The new pope, Julius the formerly Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, removed swiftly and ruthlessly. He had never forgotten how Alexander had outmaneuvered and humiliated him during the 1492 conclave. Now, at last, the tables turned. Julius refused to honor the promises made to Cesare during the brief interregnum after Alexander's death. The territories Cesare had conquered in the name of the church were reclaimed, and his titles were revoked one by one. Cesare, sensing the noose tightening, attempted to negotiate. He promised loyalty, swore fealty, even offered military support in exchange for a sliver of his former power. But Julius was unmoved. The church needed to be purified, and Cesare Borgia was the embodiment of everything the church had become under Alexander violent, corrupt, and faithless. By 1504, Cesare was arrested in Naples at the request of Julius and sent to Spain as a prisoner. There, he was held in the fortress of Medina del Campo. It seemed like poetic justice. The man who once commanded armies and executed princes, now confined to a stone cell, far from the land he sought to rule. And yet, Cesare was not done. In 1506, in a daring escape, he fled Spanish custody and sought asylum with his brother-in-law, King John III of Navarre. There, he tried to revive his fortunes as a military commander. But it was a desperate bidon born of pride more than strategy. His final campaign, in the service of Navarre's minor skirmishes, was a pale reflection of the bold conquests he had once led across Italy. On the 12th of March, 1507, near the town of Vienna, Cesare was ambushed during a routine patrol. He was cut off from his men, forced to fight alone. The once great Duke of Valentinois died sword in hand, his body stripped and abandoned by enemies who didn't even recognize him. His naked corpse was later found in a vineyard, riddled with wounds. In his final moments, there was no grandeur, no papal blessing, no armies, no family, just a fallen prince, betrayed and forgotten. And thus ended the life of the man Niccolò Machiavelli would one day hold up as the archetype of ruthless ambition in the prince. Cesare Borgia had tried to mold history in his image, but history molded him instead into a cautionary tale. But what of Rome? What of the Vatican, which had for over a decade served as the lair of the Borgia dynasty? Pope Julius II worked tirelessly to distance the church from the stench of the Borgia legacy. He commissioned grand artistic works to beautify and sanctify the Vatican, including the early efforts that would one day result in Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. He reformed aspects of papal governance, reasserted papal authority over the papal states, and restored a degree of spiritual credibility to the office of the Pope. But the damage had been done. The world had seen the depths of papal corruption, and the illusion of spiritual supremacy had cracked. The common man had begun to question the authority of the Church. If a man like Alexander VI could wear the mitre, then what truly separated popes from princess or sinners? This growing distrust would fuel a storm that was still building in the north. Martin Luther, a German monk disillusioned with the Church's greed and indulgence trade, was already brooding over the theological and moral decay he saw in Rome. It was Alexander VI's era that lit the match. The Protestant Reformation, though ignited years later, was kindled by the Borgia fire. As for Lucrezia, she outlived the chaos. After her marriage into the Este family, she became the Duchess of Ferrara. There, she lived in relative peace, earning a reputation as a patron of the arts and a capable administrator. Some even saw her as a symbol of grace after disgrace. Yet her name, like her family's, remained steeped in suspicion. She was the Borgia daughter forever, linked to poison, incest, and ambition, whether fairly or not. And what of Alexander VI's remains? His tomb, originally set in the old St. Peter's Basilica, was moved during later renovations. Today, he rests beneath the Church of Santa Maria in Monserrato, mostly forgotten, rarely visited. There is no grand monument. No tourists flock to his grave. The man who once ruled Christendom with an iron fist lies in near obscurity, a silence far louder than condemnation. Still, his shadow lingers. For historians, Alexander VI remains an enigma. Some argue he was merely a man of his time using tools every other prince used, just more effectively. Others see him as the most damning evidence of how deeply power can corrupt. He was a father who turned his children into weapons, a pope who traded salvation for coin, and a man who bent the church to his will and snapped its spine in the process. Centuries have passed since Rodrigo Borgia Pope Alexander gripped the reins of Christendom, but his name still echoes with infamy, not merely as a footnote to corruption, but as its very emblem. His was not the quiet, slow erosion of virtue over time, but the violent, theatrical unmasking of everything the papacy had claimed to oppose. In one man, the world saw how absolute power could strip holiness bare. But history is rarely black and white. To dismiss Alexander VI as merely a villain is to ignore the deeper rot in the church that allowed such a man to rise. He did not forge the tools of his corruption. He found them ready-made, waiting. Nepotism, simony, indulgences, and political warfare had long simmered in the corridors of the Vatican. What Alexander did was use them with unprecedented boldness, clarity, and intent. And for a time, it worked. He ruled for 11 years, a long reign for any pope, let alone one so universally condemned. He held together a crumbling Italy, manipulated France and Spain with ease, and imposed order over Rome through fear and gold. He was, in the coldest political terms, effective. But effectiveness does not excuse evil. His genius was not in leadership, it was in domination. And domination without morality leaves only scars. To understand Alexander's legacy, one must consider both the destruction he wrought and the reform he inadvertently provoked. By the early 16th century, the Catholic Church faced an existential crisis. The authority of the Pope had been weakened not by outsiders, but by internal rot. Borgia's excesses had exposed the Vatican's vulnerability. In taverns, pulpits, and princely courts across Europe, murmurs grew. If a man like Alexander could rule the Church, could the Church truly claim to speak for God? These murmurs found a voice in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle Church. While Alexander was already 14 years in the grave, his ghost hovered over the document. The selling of indulgences, which Luther so vehemently condemned, had become institutionalized under Alexander to fund his political ambitions. His papacy, more than any other, stood as the cautionary tale of unchecked ecclesiastical power. The Protestant Reformation tore Europe apart. Wars erupted, monarchs broke from Rome, and the once unified Western Church fractured into pieces. Rome, in many ways, had reaped what Alexander had sown, and yet the Church survived. It reformed itself, slowly and painfully. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century sought to purify doctrine and practice. Future popes tightened discipline, reduced public scandal, and tried to walk a straighter path. But never again would the papacy possess the kind of undisputed, untouchable power it had during the Renaissance. That era died with the Borgias. In the centuries that followed, the name Borgia became legend-twisted and retold. Plays, paintings, novels, operas, and later, television shows resurrected them as archetypes of lust, cruelty, and ambition. Alexander became the corrupt pope, Cesare the ruthless prince, Lucrezia the beautiful poisoner. Whether these caricatures reflect truth or not, they endure, because the reality behind them was already so unbelievable. Yet, in scholarly circles, debate persists. Was Alexander VI truly the most evil pope in history? Some point to later pontiffs who committed atrocities of war, or whose cowardice enabled greater evils. Others argue that Alexander's open vices, as shocking as they were, pale in comparison to quiet genocides or theological cruelty. But few contest that Alexander made no effort to veil his sin. He relished power for its own sake. He spoke of virtue, but trafficked in vice. His papacy did not fail by accident, it succeeded through corruption. And perhaps that is what disturbs us most. Rodrigo Borgia was not an outsider. He was the Church. He rose through its ranks, bore its robes, spoke its prayers, and still he ruled like a despot. He proved that holiness could be imitated, even as it was hollowed out. He demonstrated that the mask of faith could hide the face of ambition. And in doing so, he forced future generations to ask, how much of the Church is divine and how much is simply human? Today, tourists walk the Vatican's gilded halls, marveling at the art, the architecture, the grandeur. Few pause to imagine the sins soaked into those stones, but they are there. Behind every golden arch and painted fresco lies a history of men flawed, brilliant, corrupt, devout who shaped the Church not always through holiness, but through hunger. And none were hungrier than Alexander VI. His legacy is not simply one of evil deeds, it is a mirror held up to power itself. He reminds us that institutions, even those built on sacred vows, are only as incorruptible as the men who lead them. So when history names him the most evil pope, it does so not out of slander but memory, a memory sharpened by horror, cemented by consequence, and etched into the very bones of the Church he once ruled.